But first, Florida last year saw an average of 922 new residents arrive each day, and a whole lot of them found their way to St. Johns County. It's been that way for more than a decade, and the growth pressures are real. Here to discuss how it started and how it's going, we're joined by St. Johns County Administrator Joy Andrews. Joy, welcome back to the program.
Good morning, Ann.
So last week you updated the County Commission on $820 million in infrastructure projects. That includes more than 100 capital projects that are underway or in the process. But what does that $820 million represent in terms of the total need that exists in St. Johns County? What is the pent-up demand?
Well, that's a great question. I would say I really can't even top of my head to give you a percentage of the need in terms of infrastructure projects, but primarily it's in the categories of transportation, roadway expansion improvement, public safety, parks and libraries, and also coastal protection. And of course, utility is always its own segment of infrastructure projects that needs to be managed alongside with all these other projects and categories.
So if it's fair to say that there is an unmet need and a demand that exists beyond what you have the ability to pay for at this point, I guess the question is kind of how far behind is the county? What would it take to catch up?
Well, $820 million, I would say probably half of it is utility, and the other half of it is the transportation, is the parks and libraries, the public safety and coastal protection. And this is really just covering 2 years of capital improvement projects that we're talking about. And I would say the next 5 years, this is going to continuously to be the same scale and the complexity of the projects that we're going to manage. And I think 5 years from now, we're going to be at a very good point. But I would say by the end of 2027, you're going to see a lot of relief in the congestion. You're going to see a lot of relief in primarily, I think it's the interchange of different major corridors in St. Johns County. And by end of 2027, we're going to have our 4 new regional parks built. And we're going to have our renovation of this one major regional park in Davis Park, primarily in Ponte Vedra and Nocatee, and 3 new libraries built. And that actually is in addition to the new library we just built in Hastings, so 4 altogether. So I think you're going to see a lot of relief in the congestion, really, for the after-school programming, our libraries. And I think the coastal projects is going to be probably in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be continuously to be high demand, especially on the coastline between south of Guana to Fulano. And that's the South Ponte Vedra project that we are working with Army Corps. And that's going to be a 5 to 10 year project.
Sure. I mean, that area is really critically eroded, something that threatens not only the homes, but A1A, which is a highway,
Absolutely.
obviously, that is of significance. When it comes to the relief that is needed and the tax dollars available, how much of that relief that you're anticipating is coming from the continued growth of St. Johns County?
So our funding approach for these projects strategically for the next 5 and 10 years, hopefully, is going to be a good, healthy divide amongst. One is the impact fee, which is paid by the developers. So these ongoing projects are part of the kind of planned development mitigation obligation by these developers. So impact fee is going to play a really major role in the funding makeup for these projects, especially roads, and parks and public safety. Now, coastal projects is completely different animal that we're talking about, different types of a funding structure.
Can I ask you before I just kind of stop you there for a second, if impact fees are playing a major role in financing the infrastructure needs, it is fair to say that continued growth and escalating growth in St. Johns County is part of the calculation, is part of the formula that you're relying on in order to be able to pay for these changes.
That is accurate.
Yeah. And so I'm curious about that because we know that your board a lot of the members on your board of county commissioners ran on a slow growth or no growth platform. And that is something I think they're saying because they're hearing that from the community. And the community has been pretty vocal about feeling like they're fed up with growth and that they don't want to see any more growth. Some want a moratorium, some want a cessation entirely. So, how do you square what the community is saying, what your own board has said, at least when they were running for office, with the reality of needing to depend on that growth to pay for future improvements?
So I think it's really a balance act. So our five elected officials are tasked with a very challenging task to balance the need for expansion of infrastructure, which really relies heavily on the development's contributions and mitigation obligations. But at the same time, I think it's worthy of noting that a lot of entitlements and anticipated impact fee collection is already in the pipeline. So it's not new development. The board gets to make a policy decision to stop. So if we are looking at 50 to 60,000 entitlements that are already on the book, had been planned and approved, those impact fee collection is going to happen. It's just a matter of timing.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the projects that we're planning in the next 5 years is relying on those collection. But if you were talking about decades from now, we were talking about long-term strategic planning. Yes, I think a smart growth, a well-timed growth with a proactive planning for these infrastructure projects is really the goal, and it's the kind of the task of our elected body.
And so, if the impact fees that you're going to be collecting, those are projects in the pipeline, and certainly there is a lot in the pipeline. I mean, there's a lot that's going to happen in St. Johns County in terms of growth and development, even if you didn't approve another single project. But would you say that since this new commission took office, that there has been any measurable slowdown or cessation of growth development plans approvals?
Yeah, no doubt about that. I would say the slowing of the new development is absolutely visible and it's palatable. I think the communities can feel it. Least 5,000 units have been denied in the past 3 years. So really the only biggest development, a new development I can remember since I became administrator was the beginning of my career as administrator was the Greenbrier project in slash Hilo project. And I know at the time that project brings a couple thousand units, I think 3,000 units plus, a huge,
Where is that located?
and that is the northwest part of the county. So
Okay.
it's west part of close to Shearwater and Aberdeen, and west part of 210. Um, kind of to your point, the balancing act of bringing dollars and resource to expand the roadway projects that you already need um, played a huge consideration in that approval project. So Hilo project brought in $15 million upfront to expand Longleaf Pine Parkway, which was completed winter of last year. So that was really the last project I can recall. And really, I think that was also a response to the residents' desire to see the slowing down of the growth, but at the same time, see meaningful resource to be allocated outside of our taxpayers' dollars to expand those roads.
I want to come back to the subject of roads in just a minute, but in terms of those 5,000 units that were denied, are you seeing those staying off the table now that they've been denied, or are you seeing developers come back with renewed requests or even with lawsuits? So we know that there's a very strong property rights laws in Florida that sometimes allow a developer to sue and say that you're not letting me use this property to its highest and best use. And, then sometimes the county has to come back and say, okay, we're going to approve it after all.
Yeah, I think in the lawsuit that you're talking about, the Robinson track, there's definitely that balance act also how you respect private property rights, but at the same time, legally and respectfully plan the community growth in a way that our current residents who are living here or working here can stomach and also enjoy the quality of life they had expected from this county. I think most of the developers have kind of got the idea that this board is not in any hurry to approve any new development. So we're not seeing a lot of application at least a large application. Most of the land use items that we have experienced in past probably a couple of years are smaller, way smaller scale, rezoning or change of the use of residential lots and or approval of a some sort of a waivers, but really nothing big. And I think that is really a reflection of the policies that the board has set the tone for the development community.
Some of those choices are out of the hands of the board. Certainly, it went through this long process of community involvement to develop its new comprehensive plan for development, which is basically a 25-year look ahead at how do we want our county to look. And there were many meetings, a lot of input, as we said, and then it goes to the state, and the state basically says they reject it because it's too strong on issues of development. It's too strong on issues of conservation or perhaps things like providing for pedestrians and bicycle paths. So the county then has to soften its comp plan. And so despite all of this input from the county and the support of the citizens for this direction, the state has basically clamped down on that.
Yes. So the state basically passed a law basically saying that any of your long-term strategic planning for your land cannot be overly restrictive and cannot be overly burdensome. So those are the two criterias that basically did
And who makes the
us.
determination of overly burdensome?
I think there is kind of subjective, I would say, subjective, but basically the benchmark is going to be what you had. And so if you are requiring people to have, let's just say, if you require people in the current plan, 25 feet buffer, and you're asking the new development with the new plan a 50 feet buffer, then that is overly burdensome and restrictive. So we can now create more hoops, so to speak, for the new development through this comprehensive plan update.
All right. We have a call from John on the south side. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I watch the concerns of people in St. Johns County about new development and in existing communities like Shearwater as an example. I'm through that community quite often, and the roads are actually quite terrible at this point. There's lots of patches and so forth on the roads, and I think that might contribute to, the dismay of some St. Johns County residents that they just can't keep up with the development. How is it that these communities are established with that level of infrastructure that's seemingly inadequate over time? And I'd appreciate it if you could address that. And I'll take the call. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'll ask you to answer that, Joy, but just preface it by saying that Shearwater is off of County Road 210, west of 95, south of 210, which is an area that's seen a tremendous amount of growth.
Yes, and I'm happy to answer that question, John. And that's a great question. I think there is a distinction we have to make. And in usually a development such as Shearwaters, they have their private CDD and they have their own private homeowner association, which usually if they don't dedicate their private roads to the county, they are not county roads. So the quality of the roads
Is that the case with this one?
that in Shearwater, within the community, the Shearwater's roads are part of their CDD maintenance requirement. Now, if we're talking about 210 to get to Shearwater, then that is something the county is working on, and that is the section of the road that we're really working on this year and next year, and hopefully we're going to complete by summer of 2026. That is the widening of Greenbrier and 210.
And so if those roads are under the purview of the developer within the Shearwater community, is there nothing that the county can do at the front end to ensure that those roads are better so that residents aren't living in a overly congested community?
Well, any development, when they come in and they ask for whether it's a plan or construction permit, we have design criteria, we have engineering criteria that they have to meet. But then just remember, CDD is its own covenant restriction. It's privately owned and agreed upon. And so the maintenance is truly on the community. And it's on the resource that they can collect in the community.
We've got a call from Sally in Springfield. Good morning, Sally. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I wondered if the commissioner could speak on that I believe it's called an agri-hood that was proposed by a builder, and I think it was on 206, but it was turned down. And to me, it sounded like a great idea for community if there has to be another community. And if they applied again, would you consider it? Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. We should say that Joy is a county administrator, not a commissioner, but she, this agri-hood project was, I think the concern there was that it was going to be turning existing farmlands into essentially a 3,000 home residential property.
Yeah, I think that is, Sally, what you're referencing to, I think is the Robinson track, which
That is the subject of litigation right
that
now.
is a subject of litigation. So I want to be very cautious about really addressing this. But the board had denied this project entirely because of its new entitlement with I would say confidently perceived lack of infrastructure, primarily roads.
Getting to it.
Yes.
Okay. I do want to ask you about roads. I said I wanted to come back to it. I mean, one of the things is roads to deal with growth, and that's an ongoing challenge. But there's also this issue of road quality being undermined by climate change and the environment and flooding. And so there's a lot of areas of St. Johns County that are starting to experience flood events, rainfall events that kind of destroy the roadbed. You get a much less durable, longer lasting road than you might otherwise. What is the scale of that problem of trying to fix roads that have been damaged by, say, flooding?
I would say it primarily probably is applicable to south portion of the county. So if we're talking about a shore area, and certainly I think A1A along the line of Summer Haven all the way up to Fulano, we have experienced a lot of major storms that has really led to the collapsing of these roadways. So I think that's absolutely a very legitimate concern. But I do want to also add to this topic, the standard of building these roads is also very heavily regulated by the Florida Department of Transportation. So again, there's also the balance act of how much more are you going to require to enhance the standard of the road construction, because what we're experiencing now is the cost of the construction has skyrocketed, which contributed largely to some of the roads were planned for and that are unable to be completed within the timeline that we had expected.
We are talking to Joy Andrews. She is a county administrator in St. Johns County. If you have questions or comments, you can reach us at 904-549-2937. You can also email comments or questions about St. Johns County growth and development to First Coast Connect at wjct.org. We have a call from Bill in Lakewood. Good morning, Bill. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on. And I appreciate what St. Johns County is trying to do to limit development. But I want to throw in there, before I ask my question, that there is such a thing as lands unsuitable for development, and there is such a thing as practical limits to growth. So my question, I want to focus for now on water. Is the county still approving septic for new developments? Because given our water challenges, that's just insane. Also, any new development is drawing more water from the rivers of the aquifers and is putting more effluent back into our waterways. So whether the state wants to recognize that or not, more development in those regards is making St. Johns County a worse place to live, not a better one.
Thank you, Bill, for your comments. The septic is a good question. I know here in Jacksonville, they're spending, ultimately it will be probably billions of dollars to remove septic systems that have failed over the years and replace them with sewer. And yet Duval County and Jacksonville continue to permit projects and entire developments that are on septic systems. What's the situation in St. John's?
I am really not aware of any larger scale of development that is being approved with only septic system. In fact, we are actually doing the opposite. The board just went through a discussion, and we're bringing a policy change before the board for a countywide septic to sewer system conversion program. The program like this is really beneficial for our aquifer, the health of the environment. Um, One thing to be cautioned with that is that there is a cost to the residents because they certainly were paying for a completely different system to be connected to the county system. It requires a lot of connections. It requires really infrastructure. So we're very cognizant about the cost that could go on our residents. So we're developing and design this program where that we can methodically remove those septic tanks and then connect them to the county sewer system with a affordable payment plan and sort of scaled fee rates for our residents.
To his other point, even if a system is in place that is not a septic system but is a sewer system, that effluent goes somewhere. It goes into the river ultimately, and that has been facing a lot of pollution challenges, algal blooms, high levels of nutrients and things that come from sewage and wastewater. So, what is the prospect for just coping with that additional waste stream as growth continues in St. Johns County?
Well, that is really, really good question. It has a very complex answer to it, and I can probably only be qualified to scratch the surface of it. We have experts in the county is actively addressing that issue, but in terms of managing the discharge to our water bodies, is highly regulated by the state of Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So there is new Senate bill, House bills that have been passed is regulating the amount of nutrients you can discharge to water bodies. There are very stringent assessments frequently to be done. And I think that also really shifted the way that we can actually manage our wastewater treatment plants. Again, it kind of goes back to the balance of regulation and the cost, and it's very similar to the road. We are going to experience, and I think very similar to JEA in Jacksonville or this region, a higher cost for wastewater treatment, which is going to eventually go on our residents' bills to pay for their water and their wastewater treatment. And those are directly related to the new regulation on how much you can really discharge, or what body you can discharge. In fact, there's this one a new challenge that we're working through is that at what point that we are disallowed to discharge any wastewater after its treatment, or do we actually incur hundreds of millions of dollars to talk about deep well injection and things like that? So it's a very convoluted question, and the answers really require, I think, from the local level, from the state level, a very methodical and comprehensive views of how we can actually address the environment without overburdening our residents.
I want to ask about the money for infrastructure, because there was this period where all of a sudden there was this money under the Biden administration, this Build Back Better bill, which was basically providing, millions, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to entire regions for things like bridges and roads and wastewater treatment systems and connectivity. A lot of that money has just gone away under this administration. Were there projects that you were counting on that money for that you now have to find a different funding source for?
I think that the transition of administration certainly brings a lot of challenges in terms of the funding of the projects. There wasn't any, we don't plan for projects with a funding source that is not confirmed. So I think the gap, if any, would occur during the transition. So let's just say I can use one example that is the elimination of railroad off of 210. So we have a railroad going through on US 1 alongside of US 1, and we have on grade passing of from 210 to US 1, which creates safety issues and also congestions. So during the transition of the administration, there were a lot of grants available for railroad elimination for really eliminating the safety concerns.
Is that eliminating the railroad track or creating a flyover?
It is the latter. So it
Okay.
is eliminating the on-grade passing by having a overpass. So that funding was reprogrammed. It became a different program. So we are really in the process of gearing up to figure out what are the projects that is more in line with the new program. So for example, transportation projects in the past, we had this thing called BRIC grant, and that went away. And but now the new programs has been announced. It's called BUILD grant. It's BUILD. In fact, Chair Murphy and I actually went to DC to specifically talk to DOT staff to figure out how can we win those grants to bring dollars to St. Johns County. So currently we have two projects are in the running. One is the 2209 expansion, interchange expansion.
What road is that?
That is 2209 with 210 interchange. So that's very close to the south portion of 9B. So that it takes you to 9B.
Okay.
And that is very much a bottleneck for northwest part of the county. And the other grant that we are going to very strongly pursue is the expansion of 16, which is from IGP to
International
95.
Golf Parkway.
Yes.
To 95. That's on State Road 16.
Yes, and that's about 6 mile stretch. And again, going back to kind of the cost, because of the construction standard and things like that, it's probably close to $150 million.
Wow. We are talking to Joy Andrews. She's the county administrator in St. Johns County. If you have questions about growth or management in St. Johns County, you can email First Coast Connect at wjct.org, or you can call us live on air at 904-549-2937. We've been talking a lot about the northern portion of the county, sort of the middle portion of the county. I want to talk about the southern portion of the county, which is less developed. Some of it is large agricultural lands, and those lands could be impacted by a bill that's moving through the legislature right now in Tallahassee, this so-called blue ribbon bill. It would label projects of a certain size, essentially a very large size. It would put them beyond the purview of the county commission or the residents. It would essentially shut them out of the process if they met some criteria for development. And we've talked a little bit on this program before about this blue ribbon bill, but what are you hearing from your commission? What are you hearing from residents who might have concerns? I mean, there are a couple of very large parcels in southern St. Johns County that could essentially be developed to the whim of a developer with no local input whatsoever if this bill was approved.
Well, our board members individually, we have not had a so-called sunshine discussion amongst the five related to this bill yet. But I think every individual commissioners from the five elected officials are concerned about the impact of this bill. We are very closely monitoring where this bill is going through, and I think it has gone through one of the committees. So we're monitoring the progress of it. The bill of such a complexity with such a large impact, we expect that to go through a fairly long process. So yeah, I think that is something that is definitely high on the list of our legislative monitoring.
And is it something that you're hearing anything from residents about so far? Any concerns from the community?
Not myself personally, particularly, but we have a couple, let's say PZA members who often attend our board meetings, and we have some private discussions about the type of impact it may have on St. Johns County.
That's the planning and zoning
Yes.
administrators?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. We've got a call from Mike in St. Johns County. Good morning, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question, I'm going back to County Road 210 now. I'm talking about the portion from Greenbrier down to about Cimarron, that portion specifically. That has taken way too long, and it's still not finished. You've been working on it over 3 years. And I guess it's after the fact now how the commissioners, maybe previous commissioners, approved all this crazy growth without the infrastructure in place. But that's terrible. It takes at least twice as long to get anywhere out here when it's busy because of all the traffic back up there. When is that going to be done? I heard you said the Greenbrier portion is going to be done like this summer, but this thing should have been done long before that. I think you started on this before you did that Greenbrier section.
Mike, thank you for your comments. That's something I guess you've probably not the first time you've heard that
Yeah. So the whole section of West 210 is, even though they look like a continuation of 210, they are funded very differently. They're funded, some of them are funded with prior development obligation, which a lot of time the collection of those prop share is very much related to the phasing of the project. And I think this listener was right that some of the projects were approved long ago, not even just a few years ago, probably a decade ago. So phasing of these projects really affect the ability of us collecting the funding to actually put that into the project. And there's a portion of the 210 was also funded by strictly St. Johns County's general fund and transportation trust fund. So there is a lot of coordination and collaboration of different sections and who's paying for what. But I think one lesson our board has learned is that the phasing approach of these development is no longer working for St. Johns County. And that's why I mentioned earlier that Hilo project was approved because a one-time lump sum upfront construction dollars to be contributed to the project. But I think slowly we're going to phase out some of those projects that were approved long time ago, and collecting those construction dollars and resource to put them into actual projects.
You mean when you say phase out projects that were developed already, what does that mean?
So let's just say 15 years ago that there was a project, and I won't even name the name, but typical method of approving these projects is they are phased as they grow. So let's just say a project has 3 phases, and each phase has 500 homes. So back then, I think the method, and I think this predates many of us, is that if you build 500 homes, then you'll be obligated to do certain things. Either you're going to build a section of the road on your own to our standard, or you're going to contribute, say, $10, $15 million to be part of that construction as a proportionate share. And if you don't meet that obligation, you will not move on to the next phase. So you will be stopped at phase 1. So that really is very much what we have experienced with the Grand Oaks, which is right off of 16. And they were stopped right at phase 1 without
Because they weren't paying for the roads?
Because they really didn't have ability to pay for the roads because the timing of the construction, the cost of the construction has changed drastically. So I think it kind of goes back to the question about 210 and goes back to the question about what is the right approach to, if we were to approve any development, to require our developer to contribute. We do have larger developments such as Silverleaf or Nocatee. They are kind of a master plan development. So their transportation is well planned in advance, and construction by the developers, which is going to be very much preferred approach in the future.
Yeah, and just very briefly, this objections by residents to growth in St. Johns County dates back 15 or 20 years. And at the time, people would say this is going to be ruinous for the county. Do you think that there's anything 20 years from now, are people going to look back on this county commission and your administration and say, well, they got it right? Or do you think they were going to be hearing the same complaints that we are right now about 210 and what's happening on State Road 16 20 years from now?
Well, if 20 years from now and that the residents are still going to experience the same challenge today, which is very much catching up the infrastructure to meet the needs of new residents, then I feel like I'm not doing my job properly. And this is why we are now putting in long-term transportation planning committee together. We're looking at transportation model in conjunction with TPO and also our school system to plan those major roads and corridors to move people as quickly as we can in advance of any potential trip counts that is going to be put on the road. So that is our hope and our goals.
All right. Well, it's good to talk to you. St. Johns County Administrator Joy Andrews, thanks so much for being available and talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.